Welcome to States and Migration in Europe, a podcast that explores the interactions between the movement of people and the history of Europe. I'm Emmanuel Comte, and today we have a special guest, Ivan Katchanovski, a political scientist who teaches at the University of Ottawa. Professor Katchanovski is an expert on conflicts and democratization in Ukraine, especially the origins of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He has published 4 books and numerous articles on these topics. In this episode, we will talk about the largest movement of population in Europe since the end of the Second World War, the refugees in the Ukraine war. According to the UNHCR, today more than 8 million refugees from Ukraine have been recorded across Europe. In addition, millions have been displaced within the country. We will discuss why so many Ukrainians have fled their country, where they have gone, what challenges they face, and what the policies of the major European actors about them are. We will also examine how this large movement of population has affected domestic politics and foreign relations. Ivan Katchanovski, thank you very much for joining us today.
Again, thank you for the invitation. This is a pleasure to talk to you about this topic and very important issue to discuss.
So let's start. What made you interested in studying Ukraine's conflict and migration?
So I think this is goes back to kind of my personal experience and family experience in Ukraine. My family, my mother lived in 4 different countries without moving on her own. And she was a refugee after World War II, basically, and also as a result of ethnic cleansing. And my grandmother, she lived also in actually in 5 countries without ever moving on her own. And she was also a refugee during World War I, during World War II. So I grew up with such experience. And for me, this was very important during the Cold War, when I wanted to be a professor studying political science. Even so, it was not possible at that time, or very kind of almost impossible at that time. But after the Soviet Union collapsed, I was able to get into a PhD program and studied these issues. And I wrote my dissertation in the United States on this topic of regional political divisions and conflicts in Ukraine and Moldova, which is another post-Soviet country with similar regional conflicts and divisions that took place in Ukraine. And after the Ukraine became independent, all elections basically in Ukraine showed very strong regional divisions. And the question was why Ukraine was able to avoid such divisions, and what was the reason for such regional divisions and separatism in Ukraine? Even at the time, in the 1990s, there was very strong separatism in Crimea, which is a Russian populated region in south of Ukraine, and there was also separatism in Donbass area in eastern Ukraine. So this is why I decided to study this issue. I wrote my dissertation on this topic at George Mason University under direction of Seymour Martin Lipset, who was one of the most cited scholars in the world in political science and political sociology. And I studied with Francis Fukuyama, who was also on my dissertation committee. And this issue, which I consider to be a crucial issue, because Ukraine was at the danger of facing similar war, a similar division, a similar breakup, which took place in neighboring Moldova in the 1990s, when a separatist region of Transnistria seceded from Moldova with Russian military support. And there were similar conflicts in Georgia, in Armenia, Azerbaijan. So this was kind of very important issue to study, and I published a book based on this dissertation, and I continue to do research about these topics. And now I continue with researching war in Ukraine, which is again now would be 1 year since the Russian invasion. But before this, I also was researching war in Donbass and Maidan and other cases of political violence, in addition to historical conflicts like World War II, Soviet mass terror, and OUN and UPA.
That's fascinating. And what is your methodology? How do you conduct research on those questions?
I use the multiple methods of research, and I actually also teach research methods to my students, undergraduate students and graduate students, and I love teaching research methods, and I use them in my research myself. A combination of different methods. I use qualitative and quantitative methods. I use like qualitative interviews, content analysis of different videos. For instance, watching all the videos from the war right now on social media, like hundreds of videos each day. And this is very important because there are primary sources to be able to analyze, look into content, not just watch it, but also analyzing them in terms of the content, what they show, what they don't show, and so on. Also, I use quantitative analysis, I use survey research, and case study methods, and so also comparative analysis, which was used in my book, which and dissertation when I compared Ukraine and Moldova regional divisions and conflicts. So this is kind of approach which relies on multiple methods of research and also primary data. So I think this is one of the key differences, because a lot of people kind of when they research conflict in Ukraine, they do this based on media reports, based on secondary sources, basically. Government reports, media reports, and so on. But I am able to do this using original sources, and this is, I think, primary sources. And this is very crucial difference because not many people are able to do such research, because it requires to know Ukrainian and Russian, which is another language which is widely spoken in Ukraine, in particular in eastern Ukraine, and this is why I think such research is very difficult. It's very time-consuming to do, and but results are often not what people actually believe based on the media coverage, because they kind of if you just follow media coverage, you have one basically country and one kind of conflict. But if you do research based on primary sources and you use different sources, not just one from one side, so the issue becomes much more complex and much more difficult to research, but also kind of gives kind of evidence-based research, which is, I think, very important in this regard.
Yeah. So let's now enter into the meat of the subject matter. Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, and other parts of Ukraine in February 2022, exactly 1 year ago. So, what are the causes of this war?
Conflict started with an event which took place exactly 9 years ago in Ukraine, which was called Maidan Massacre, which was crucial conflict, crucial case of political violence, in which led to overthrow of the pro-Russian government in Ukraine. And after this, there was Russian retaliation and escalation of the conflict. And Russia annexed Crimea, which was pro-Russian region in south of Ukraine. And after this, there was a start of civil war with separatists in Donbass, which were supported by Russia, firstly indirectly, and then with direct military interventions by Russia in August of 2014 and winter 2015. And this war continued until Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. And this war now became a war between Russia and Ukraine. But this conflict goes back to basically 9 years ago, just to actual start of this conflict, when there was Western actually supported a violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government. And this and Russia basically escalated this conflict very drastically by launching illegal invasion of Ukraine under false pretext of genocide of Russian speakers in Ukraine, and claiming also falsely that there was that Ukraine is Nazi state or neo-Nazi state. Even so, there is a very strong far right in Ukraine. But Ukrainian government and Zelensky, they are not Nazis, they are not neo-Nazis, and the Ukrainian military, they are not Nazis or neo-Nazis. They are like units which are far right or even neo-Nazi-led, like Azov regiment. But this is not entire Ukrainian military or Ukrainian government. And in this regard, again, Russia also claimed that there was kind of a threat of Ukraine launching kind of military operation to take back control over Donbass, separatist control Donbass, but there is no such evidence that this was imminent such operation. Even so, Zelensky publicly stated that this was goal of his government. So I think in this regard, this is like a very complex conflict, which goes back to kind of basically 9 years ago as a result of Maidan massacre, and this massacre, which was subject of my very extensive research, and I can say beyond any reasonable doubt now, it's possible to say that this massacre was conducted not by the forces of then government of Yanukovych, but by opposition, Maidan opposition, elements of Maidan opposition, specifically from oligarchic factions and from far-right factions who actually massacred both police and Maidan protesters in order to blame the government. And they were very successful in this case, and this led to overthrow of the Ukrainian government. But this had basically very negative consequences for Ukraine, because now Ukraine faces kind of this is a result of such decisions, such actions, and this is supported by evidence, overwhelming evidence, even from the Maidan massacre trial. There are like videos of such snipers, which I also published, made public based on my research. There are testimonies by absolute majority of wounded Maidan protesters at the Maidan massacre trial and investigation in Ukraine, which I also analyzed. There are testimonies by several hundred eyewitnesses about such snipers and such massacre. And there are even forensic examination results by government experts, which were conducted for Ukrainian government investigation. But almost everything which is publicly available is not reported by the media. So this is another issue, because people kind of when they learn about Ukraine, they often have a message, an image of Ukraine which is not based on reality, but based on kind of image which is given by the media. But media is not reliable. So in this regard.
So yeah, I am of course less familiar than you. So about this these paramilitary groups that use snipers. So they played a role in the overthrow of the pro-Russian government, correct?
Yes, they did basically. They basically committed a massacre, mass killing of not only them. There were different groups of snipers. Some of them were linked to far-right organizations like Right Sector and Svoboda, and they were based in Maidan control buildings like Hotel Ukraina, which was controlled by a far-right party which called Svoboda, and they officially announced this on their website, on their kind of in the media, that before the massacre they took control over this hotel. And basically, snipers in these locations, in these buildings, they shot both at the police and the protesters, Maidan protesters, who did not expect this. But police and government snipers were blamed for this massacre. So this was specifically to blame the government. But in this massacre, in order to overthrow the government, kind of win such conflict. Even so, all the evidence shows that this was done by opposition elements, specifically from Hotel Ukraina, which was controlled by Svoboda, including by far-right. So this was not. There is no evidence at all during the Maidan massacre trial, reliable evidence of any order to massacre Maidan protesters by Yanukovych, any confessions or admissions by snipers in contrast to admissions by 14 Maidan snipers who admitted publicly that involvement in such massacre of the police and protesters. And there are also kind of no videos which show that that government forces massacred Maidan protesters. Even so, they used all the videos, but videos were shown only kind of very small fragments of videos in which police were shooting, and then protesters killed. But if you compare them, if you do a kind of content analysis of these videos, which I did, and synchronize them, it's possible to see immediately that when police were shooting, the protesters were not killed. So, and when police was not shooting, the protesters were killed. So this means there were other snipers who were killing protesters, and the police were shooting into snipers, and they were shooting also into kind of poles and ground and so on. They were not killing Maidan protesters. This is, I think, a very crucial issue, and this was misrepresented by the media.
Mm-hmm. And what was the origin of these paramilitary groups, and what was their agenda? I mean, in the origin, I mean, what was their composition? What was how were they funded? What was the organization, and what was their agenda?
there are different, like paramilitary and far-right groups. They included right sector, which was basically organization which goes back to organization called Taidan, named after Stepan Bandera. And this organization considered to be successor of far-right organization called Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which Stepan Bandera faction, which was kind of organization which collaborated with Nazi Germany during World War II, in particular at the beginning of World War II and at the end of World War II, and which was involved in mass murder of Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians during World War II, specifically as a part of local police. For instance, they organized local police during the German occupation of Ukraine, and also they were involved in creation of Ukrainian insurgent army, which massacred Poles in Volhynia, my native region in western Ukraine, and they also committed terrorism and so on. And the organization, Right Sector, became their successors, and actually they adopted this slogan of ОУН and UPA, which was called Glory to Ukraine or Slava Ukraini, and Glory to the Heroes. And this is actually slogan and greeting which was adopted first by the OUN, based on Nazi kind of greeting and similar other greetings of similar other parties, along with Nazis kind of fascist style hand salute, which was kind of, and this was actually became popular and adopted by Maidan during the Maidan protests from far-right organizations like the Right Sector, and now it became kind of a mainstream greeting which is used even by Western politicians who basically have no idea about its origin or kind of claim this is like old Ukrainian greeting, which is not the case. So this is just one example. There was another organization called Svoboda. And Svoboda was originally a far-right party, which was a neo-Nazi party called Social National Party, and name after basically kind of National Socialist Party of Nazi Germany, Nazi Party, and they changed their kind of ideology into more moderate after they entered in mainstream of Ukrainian politics shortly before Maidan and during the Maidan. So they became just a typical far-right party, and they were also involved in this Maidan massacre. In addition to this, there was neo-Nazi party which was called Patriot of Ukraine and Social National Assembly, which became was also involved in Maidan massacre. They were part of Right Sector during the Maidan, and after the Maidan, they organized Azov Battalion, which became Azov Regiment, which goes back to kind of to this party, which was openly neo-Nazi party, and which used neo-Nazi symbols, kind of. And now they try to again present them as again as part of mainstream and deny any like far-right ideology and so on. Even so, this was explicitly kind of stated. They used neo-Nazi symbols and ideology and so on.
Mm-hmm. And okay, I understand that those group perpetrated some violence in the middle of the Maidan protestation, and that this helped, and with the intention to have the police also to have the police accused of this violence in order to intensify the revolution. But let's also maybe put things into perspective a little bit like Russian dolls, if we can use this expression here, that often in the outbreak of a conflict, there are various dimensions of causes. So the Maidan protestation was meant about to protest about the suspension of the talks between Ukraine and the European Union for a trade agreement and a closer association between Ukraine and the European Union. So I think this aspect is quite interesting because it's not simply the relationship between Ukraine and Russia that can explain the war, or even the domestic politics within Ukraine, even though all these dimensions are also relevant. But there is also a kind of very big magnetic attraction west, which is the European Union. And this is this big magnetic attraction that that triggered massive protestation in Ukraine against the government of the pro-Russian government of Viktor Yanukovych. And this magnetic attraction, did you feel it in the country? Was there an appetite for the West as a direction rather than as a geopolitical concept? That is, was there an appetite to join the European Union in Ukraine, and what were the motivations of people?
So actually, before and during Maidan, Ukraine was split on joining the European Union and joining the Russian-led economic union. There was absolute majority of support for joining the European Union in Western Ukraine and in central Ukraine, including the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv. But in regions of south and east of Ukraine, there was support for joining economic union with Russia. So this was split, and even during the Maidan, there was about 50-50 split between supporters of Maidan or Euromaidan and opposition to Euromaidan. And the opposition, Maidan opposition, they used this refusal by or kind of reversal by Yanukovych of signing free trade and association agreement with the European Union in order to kind of launch mass protest against his government and eventually to overthrow his government. And they basically presented this agreement as basically as a European Union membership of Ukraine. So a lot of people believe that Ukraine would join European Union. That this was not just an association agreement or a free trade agreement. This was actually about Ukraine joining the European Union, which was not the case, but this was represented. And that's why a lot of people supported this, because they actually believed that this would be a European Union membership. And in my own research, and in my own publications, popular media publications since more than 20 years ago, I argued that for Ukraine to avoid such conflict, basically to avoid breakup, to become a democracy, the only chance to do this would be to join the European Union. But actually, during the Maidan, this was not the case, because the European Union at the time, when they discussed this agreement, they refused specifically even to mention a possibility that Ukraine would become a member of the European Union in the future. So this was, I think, a very important decision, and this decision had a very significant consequences, because it was possible to avoid the war in Ukraine and all the kind of conflicts by basically giving Ukraine a possibility to join the European Union, which would have, I think, then support even in eastern Ukraine or southern Ukraine, because Russia at the time did not oppose such a membership. They opposed association and free trade agreement for economic reasons, but I think they would have accepted European Union membership for Ukraine, and this was in contrast to NATO, and this was a kind of missed opportunity. But opposition used this specifically to rally support for Ukraine, and a lot of people believe that European Union will be kind of immediate. Even many scholars who study Ukraine, even after Maidan, they believe that Ukraine would join the European Union. Even so, I wrote an article on this topic, which I said this is like unlikely, even kind of looking into past experience, similar countries like Balkans and so on, this would not be very likely, because at the time even European Union did not offer any even possibility of Ukraine becoming a member of European Union. And this recently changed during the after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But again, I think this would, if Ukraine would become a member of European Union, it would take a long time to do this. It will not be just next year or a few years. It might take like 20 years or like 15 years or maybe 10 years at the best, unless something change kind of significantly.
And among the followers of Maidan, what was the thing the most appealing in the European Union? Was it the prospect of capital investment in the country, the prospect of exports to the EU, or was it the prospect of people having the right to move west toward the EU? There has been a large increase in immigration to Europe, in Ukraine, even before Maidan, in the last decades.
Yeah, I think the most important kind of appeal of the European Union for Ukraine, for Ukrainians at the time was believe that Ukraine would immediately enjoy similar standard of living as in the European Union. So this was kind of expectation of paradise. And this was promoted by opposition leaders, specifically to get support from for Maidan. They showed advertisement, basically showing Ukrainians going to vacation in Paris, basically enjoying coffee like Vienna or something like this, which was kind of very nice, and getting jobs like standards of kind of Western Europe, like England, like United Kingdom, Germany, like France and so on, Austria, without actually kind of doing much. And this was a kind of expectation that Ukraine would have such opportunity. And a lot of people also believe that they would be able to move to European Union to find jobs, and they would be able to get a lot of money, become rich. And this was a kind of expectation. Again, even so, such agreement did not include such possibility of Ukraine getting again movement job, basically ability for Ukraine to get the jobs in the European Union. But a lot of people believe this at the time, and this was specifically promoted by the opposition in order to get support for their mass protest during Maidan.
Yeah, that's very interesting because, as you know very well, the debate about the origins of the war in Ukraine has been very much focused on NATO and the enlargements of NATO. There has been a lively debate in the last years about this issue, and there is a recent book by Mary Sarotti, Not One Inch, trying to analyze how NATO ended up moving east. And this is often presented as a major reason why the war in Ukraine broke out. But as you tell us, and as I have also written myself, it has more to do with the European Union in itself than with NATO. That is, people were contemplating a higher standard of living, contemplating job opportunities, travel opportunities, immigration towards Germany, Austria, France, the UK. And all this was made possible by the European Union. So Ukraine is it's like a piece that is between two big magnets. One magnet is the EU and the other magnet is Russia. And this piece in the middle is torn apart, and we don't know in which direction it's going to go until a point where the internal pressure becomes so strong that the country just falls apart, and probably the various groups you have mentioned could have played a role. Do you think that when the revolution,
if I can add briefly to this NATO issue, because NATO also important issue. This was European Union was a kind of issue was explained to Ukrainians in order to get support for Maidan and for political opposition at the time. But NATO was also an important issue because Western countries, including the United States and NATO members, in particular also countries like in European Union, like France, Germany, the United Kingdom at the time, they supported this violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government during Maidan, de facto by means of the Maidan massacre, specifically not to support democracy, not to support any kind of European Union membership for Ukraine, but in order to contain Russia. So that's why Ukraine was very important, and this is kind of shows that support from the West, even starting with the Maidan, was motivated by not kind of by giving Ukrainians any kind of making Ukrainians Ukraine as a country similar to kind of other countries which were very successful in joining the European Union, like Poland, Czech Republic, or Slovakia, or Hungary, and even Romania and Bulgaria, but making Ukraine using Ukraine as a tool to contain Russia. And this was very different because kind of the only possibility to avoid this was making Ukraine European Union, but actually Western countries used this kind of Maidan opposition and at the time to overthrow the government, specifically for geopolitical reasons, for military purposes, in order to use Ukraine to contain Russia. And this is actually was kind of still ongoing with kind of this war in Ukraine now, because this war also became a proxy war between the West and Russia over Ukraine.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what kind of role concretely do you think Western powers play at the time of the overthrow of the pro-Russian government in Ukraine in 2014?
I think this is again a lot of documents and a lot of data are not yet public, but based on evidence which is available, I can say that they at least de facto supported this overthrow. And there are like interviews by two leaders of former kind of two leaders of Maidan opposition from Svoboda party, which is far right party, and they told Ukrainian journalists who were pro-Maidan journalists after Maidan that they met with representatives from Western countries. Some Western representatives, they do not name country, they do not name the name of this person, but they said that they had discussion before Maidan massacre. They had discussion. What would it take for Western governments to change its position, to change their position towards the Yanukovych government, to stop recognition of the Yanukovych government, and basically kind of renounce Yanukovych government, and these discussions basically involved as kind of talks how many people would need to be killed during Maidan for Western governments to change their policy of recognition of Yanukovych government. They had discussion like five. They said like 5, 10, 20. Western representatives said not enough. This would be the policy of Western governments, which only change if there would be 100 victims during the Maidan. And this is kind of just remarkable because as soon as the Maidan massacre took place, Maidan opposition immediately proclaimed heavily 100, basically heavily 100 of Maidan protesters killed. Even so, there was not number of actually killed Maidan protesters was slightly less, but they included people who were just committed suicide or died from like other diseases. They were not even were on Maidan or just killed in in other ways, in other locations, specifically to create this heavily 100 along with protesters who were killed during the Maidan massacre. And this is just I think this is one evidence which which is shows that Western countries play a certain kind of role in this regard, but there is no evidence that they were involved directly in the Maidan massacre. But they basically give such a kind of incentive to massacre Maidan protesters, specifically 100, which exactly what happened, because after Maidan massacre, without any investigation, Western governments specifically recognized the new government of Ukraine. Even so, they signed agreement, peace agreement, which promised to hold elections and to investigate Maidan massacre. This immediately was renounced by the Western governments, and now they recognize new government, and they kind of became silent about Maidan massacre investigation, and even so they talk about victims and so on. They remember Maidan protesters, but there is no pressure or any interest in investigating Maidan massacre because nobody is actually, since 9 years after Maidan massacre, there is not one person who was convicted for this massacre or is currently under arrest. So basically nobody has any kind of consequences for this Maidan massacre in terms of justice, but consequences for Ukraine were very significant. And I think Biden at the time was vice president of United States, and he says in his memoirs that he called Yanukovych right after Maidan massacre took place and told Yanukovych to not only to leave his position as a president of Ukraine, but basically to leave Ukraine at all. And this is what happened. Yanukovych was removed as a result of this massacre because he was blamed for the Maidan massacre, and there were also assassination attempts against him, according to evidence presented during trials in Ukraine. This is just, I think, I think this was a policy by the Western governments, but what exactly they did and what exactly they know, I think this will be a very crucial issue when documents would become open and available. But I think that Western governments know this happened, but obviously they know much more about what actually happened during Maidan. But obviously, for political reasons, this is not discussed and not revealed, similarly to what, for instance, happened in other cases.
So at least Western governments were prompt to recognize an alternative government in Ukraine when there was a revolution. They would not stick long with the Pro-Russian government of Viktor Yanukovych. But this is again is coherent with this intermediary zone, Ukraine as an intermediary country between the West and Russia. and the difficulty of borders in this area. There are no clear borders, and each side is trying to get a little bit further in order to feel safer. That's the long history of this region of Europe, between competing influences. But we have already started to talk about the movement of people. That is, the prospect of moving west was something at least important in the motivations of the Maidan protesters. And then, if we fast forward to 2022, when the war started, it became quite fast a major conflict in terms of displacements of population. Today, we are at 8 million people outside of Ukrainian borders in Europe. Many millions as well have been displaced within the country. So why did this war take this form? Why did this war displace so many people?
I think this is because of Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was not only limited to eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, but also to Kiev region and northern Ukraine. So a lot of people fled immediately after Russian invasion of Ukraine because they believe this was a real danger and threat to basically become in the middle of war zone. So this is like a real issue, and this is kind of as a result of such a Russian invasion. So this was main reason, the main factor, because kind of in order to avoid consequences, direct consequences of this war, or indirect consequences like losing, for instance, jobs, or losing kind of their homes, or losing like kind of their kind of electricity and so on, and ability to travel and so on. These were very important issues, and but a lot of people also moved not only because of political reasons, but also because of economic reasons, because this war opened kind of opportunity to move to the West and to more prosperous countries and to try to find jobs there, or to kind of improve their standard of living. And this is involves people who were in particular from Western Ukraine, which was not directly involved in the war, but I know that a lot of people from Western Ukraine also moved to the Western Europe, for instance, and to Poland, in order to kind of get basically better prospect, economic prospect, jobs, and security and so on, an opportunity to stay for a long time there, or even permanently. And this applies the same to Canada. There are a lot of people, for instance, in Canada, they created a program called Specific Visa program, which gave Ukrainians opportunity to find jobs in Canada after the Russian invasion. And this opportunity basically kind of applied to Ukrainians from any country of the world. You need to be a Ukrainian citizen, and it was not limited to Ukraine. And for this reason, many Ukrainians from countries like Poland, or even Western Europe, like Germany or Spain and Italy, they moved to Canada because for economic reasons, because Canadian government gave economic support. They pay money. They give a work permit to work in Canada, and there's possibility of getting permanent residence in Canada. So a lot of people use this opportunity to move to Canada. In addition to many people who actually also were genuine like refugees from this war, even so they are not recognized as refugees according to this program, but they actually were affected by this war. But many of them actually they also moved to Russia, and this is another issue which is not often discussed by the media. According to the United Nations data on refugees, there were like more than 8 million refugees registered by the United Nations, and about 3 million of them were in Russia. So and I think more than 1.5 million in Poland, and about 1 million in Germany. So this is just kind of approximate division, and so this means a lot of refugees also, specifically from Donbass, came to Russia, and this is another kind of illustration of this division in Ukraine, which is still significant in this regard.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, as the conflict was triggered to some extent by the willingness to move, and once the conflict started, people did move. So, for for pull and push reasons, as is common to say in migration studies. That is, the push reasons was that the war made people afraid for security, but also disrupted the Ukrainian economy and just distorted economic opportunities for people there. And the pull reasons, I believe, that is that both Western countries and perhaps also Russia were more willing to take on more people as there was a war raging in Ukraine, and they considered that the being open to those people was part and parcel of supporting one side in the conflict. Correct?
Yes, I think this also kind of Western governments, European Union member countries open their borders basically to Ukrainians, and a lot of Ukrainians use this opportunity. But there was one exception, one category was not allowed to exit Ukraine. This applies to Ukrainian men of fighting age, I think from 18 years of age until 60 years old. So this means Ukrainian citizens could not exit Ukraine because they were prevented from doing this with a very small number of exceptions, like people who are disabled and so on. So this means that a lot of men were not able to leave Ukraine, and this means there is a very significant gender disbalance, and a lot of immigrants or kind of migrants and refugees from Ukraine are now basically female women with children, and this is another kind of dimension which is very important because a lot of families are split, and because husbands and their sons not able to leave Ukraine, and this is a kind of issue which would have also very significant effect.
Yes, indeed. So men in age of fighting or able of fighting were prevented from leaving the country by the Ukrainian military. But about the push factor, about what led people to move, do you think that this became quite rapidly a dirty war?
So what do you mean?
That is a war in which both sides take actions against civilians, or at least the Russian side, because this is typical also of wars that involve the population. And here, as you were saying, the country was split almost 50-50 between the pro-Western side and the pro-Russian side. And so it's a war in which the population was part and parcel. It's not a war between militaries or simply between governments. It's a war of the bottom as well, because the population was organized in opposing camps, and therefore the Russians may have wanted to terrorize the population, to have some pro-Western supporters leave deliberately from certain areas. Do you think this played a role in this very big number of immigrants and displaced persons?
I think this might only apply to area of Kiev area, which was like pro-Western in terms of its orientation, the capital of Ukraine, and a lot of people in Kiev were also from Western Ukraine. But Kiev was not captured by Russians, and there was no evidence that they wanted to capture Kiev. I think they wanted to threaten Kiev with encirclement at the start of the war, specifically to force regime change in Ukraine from a pro-Western into pro-Russian government. From a client state, from a Western client state to a client state which would become client state of Russia, but this failed, and then they wanted also to basically to force Zelensky to accept their demands, like become a neutral country and demilitarize and so on. These were demands kind of often given by Putin, and there was a real possibility that Zelensky would agree to such demands. And there were negotiations involving Prime Minister of Israel, and he recently confirmed Ukrainian media reports and other sources that such agreement was very close to being accepted, or there was a real possibility of such agreement, but because of Western countries, in particular the United Kingdom and the United States, opposed this agreement was not signed by by Zelensky. And after this, there was finding of evidence against civilians in Bucha and so on. So according to my research, academic research, including this study which I presented at the annual meeting of American Political Science Association in Montreal, there is no evidence of any genocide. So there is no genocide of Ukraine, contrary to claims by Putin and the Russian government, which used to justify this invasion of Ukraine, claiming that there was a genocide of Russian speakers. There is no such evidence of genocide of Russian speakers in Ukraine, but also there is no evidence to support the claim that there is a genocide of Ukrainians committed by Russian forces. But there is evidence of war crimes committed, in particular against civilians, and most war crimes, according to my research and evidence from various sources, was committed by Russian forces, in particular during the occupation of Ukrainian regions, in particular Kyiv region, like in Bucha. There was evidence that Russian military forces units or individual soldiers killed several dozen of Ukrainian civilians in Bucha and members of civil territorial defense in Bucha during the occupation. So there is such evidence, but there is no evidence that this was a part of genocide or any kind of deliberate targeting of civilians. And the same applies to other cases of when a lot of civilians were killed, like during missile strikes by Russia and so on. I look into all these cases, and all the evidence suggests that basically this were use of their missiles aimed at military targets, but they missed this. So this would be an example of indiscriminate use of military force, because in some cases this were dual use targets, or they were in the middle of cities and so on, and a lot of civilians died or were killed during such missile strikes. So there is no evidence of a deliberate extermination or genocide of Ukrainians by Russian forces or by Ukrainian forces, but there is evidence of use of indiscriminate killing and indiscriminate force, in particular like artillery missiles and so on against in cities or other locations, and primarily by Russian forces. So there was also evidence of execution of prisoners of war, particularly Russian prisoners of war by Ukrainian forces, and also killing of civilians in Mariupol, in eastern Ukraine, by a far-right neo-Nazi Azov-led battalion or regiment. But this, again, would not constitute a genocide. And I think in the regard of division of Ukraine, I think also this is very important, because most of conflict and most of the casualties take place in regions which were like Donbass, which are pro-Russian regions. Mariupol, this was a relatively pro-Russian region, according to survey research which I conducted after Maidan. And so this Donbass was most pro-Russian region in Ukraine after Crimea. And other regions of Ukraine were also like pro-Russian, relatively pro-Russian, like Kherson and Zaporizhia and Kharkiv region, which were occupied by Russian forces, but they were not. But by pro-Russian, it does not mean that they supported a Russian annexation of these territories, or they supported a Russian invasion of Ukraine, because there is a big difference of basically of supporting integration with Russia, or economic union with Russia, and supporting a secession of these regions and joining Russia or annexation by Russia. According to public opinion poll which I conducted, which I commissioned and conducted by Ukrainian Institute in 2014 after Maidan, the only region which had majority support for separatism was in Donbass. So Donbass was the only region in which basically most people would support Russian annexation and joining Russia. When entirely in all other regions, including pro-Russian regions like Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Kharkiv region, support for joining Russia was marginal. So this is, I think, very important, because now after Russian invasion, this support even decreased much more significantly, because a lot of people, even so they were like initially pro-Russian, they supported like economic ties to Russia and so on, and cultural ties and personal ties to Russia. They, after Russian invasion, they became more anti-Russian, or but definitely most of them did not support Russian invasion and annexation of Russia, of their territories by Russia.
So you don't think that one side or the other tried deliberately to move people away, to get rid of some kinds of people broadly defined?
No, there is also no evidence of ethnic cleansing, like what took place, for instance, during wars in Bosnia and in Kosovo. There was no such evidence in the case of Ukraine. No ethnic cleansing evidence. And according to United Nations estimate or report for casualties, civilian casualties, there was, I think, at least now they reported, I think, about 9,000 civilians who are identified as killed in Ukraine, confirmed killed in Ukraine. So this would exclude a few thousand casualties in Mariupol, but the number would be still like about 12,000 civilians killed during this war, which would be much smaller compared to military casualties, which would be, in case of Ukrainian forces, now more than 30,000 killed, and Russian forces, according to BBC, now they confirm about 14,000 Russian military forces killed in Ukraine. And in addition to this, there were like approximately 7 or at least 7,000 separatist forces in Donbass, from Donbass republics, killed in Ukraine. So this is kind of a conflict in which mostly casualties are not civilians, but military casualties. And this is different from, for instance, war in Bosnia, when there was actually massacre in Srebrenica and a lot of ethnic cleansing, and most casualties were actually civilians, not military. In case of war in Ukraine, this is a reverse, I think. This is one aspect which is also not kind of often misrepresented by the media and by the politicians for political purposes, but based on the research, based on the evidence, I think this is kind of, there is no kind of evidence of any genocide or any kind of ethnic cleansing or deliberate targeting civilians as a part of policy. But there are obviously war crimes, and in Bucha, like there is clear like evidence, a lot of evidence that Russian forces killed civilians, like at least few dozen or several dozen civilians were killed, is a kind of as a result of summary executions, and in addition, also not civilians but also territorial defense members. They were executed by Russian forces or also killed, for instance, indiscriminately, kind of when they tried to approach Russian forces or were rounded as suspected, for suspected helps to Ukrainian military forces. And this is kind of just one example, but there is no such evidence that this was systematic policy applied to other regions of Ukraine. And according to United Nations data, almost all casualties, I think more than 90, I don't remember exactly, but more than 90% definitely were casualties as a result of use of wide area kind of weapons with wide area impact, like artillery, missiles, and so on, and not not by bullets. So casualties by bullets were small, just few percent of overall casualties in Ukraine among civilians.
And in this conflict, many people have left, but some people also have gone to Ukraine, and in particular to Crimea. There have been indications that Russia has been moving people to Crimea precisely to repopulate this country with loyal people. What is your take on this issue?
No, I think there's evidence that Russia, there's a lot of refugees from Ukraine into Russia who went voluntarily. Most of them went voluntarily, but there was also evidence that Russia basically tried to kind of force people, some people to move into Russia. In particular, for instance, during a siege of Mariupol, Russian forces told people that they can move out of Mariupol, but they only gave exit to Russia, towards Russia, not to Ukrainian control territory. And so this means there were people who were kind of basically forced to or have no choice and move to Russia, but it's not possible, I think, for them to stay for a very long time. They had the opportunity to leave Russia afterwards for a long time and move to Western Europe, for instance, or other countries like Baltic states, without actually kind of being forced to stay there. There were also children who were removed to Russia, but most of them are orphanage, people without orphanage, in orphanages. So they were kind of removed to Russia from Donbass and from other regions of Ukraine which were occupied by Russia. And in addition to this, I think in Crimea is not kind of a region in which most of refugees went, because Crimea is kind of in Ukraine was always kind of region which was kind of very kind of popular and very desirable region, because this is basically like a Mediterranean climate, like basically for this kind of this south of France or Italy, like south of Italy, or like south of, or like Greece, basically have climate which is kind of very warm and very kind of nice climate, sea and so on. So this was a very expensive place to live, and a lot of people, politicians and government officials, had their dachas, basically in their apartments in this area of Ukraine, in Crimea. And there was also immigration of Crimean Tatars after Ukraine independence, because they were expelled from Crimea after World War II by Stalin. So a lot of them returned to Crimea. And so as a result of this Russian invasion, there were some people who moved to Crimea from areas occupied by Russia, but this is not a most populated region of which became kind of a center for refugees, because a lot of refugees moved to other areas controlled by Russia, and for instance in Donbass or in the south of Kherson region, or they were settled in other regions of Russia, including some in Siberia, but a lot of moved to other regions, like neighboring regions like Kuban or Rostov region or Belgrade region.
After the push, that is what pushes people to leave. We mentioned also the pull, that is what attracts people. So, of course, some people have been attracted by better opportunities in Western countries, but government policies have also played a role. So you have just mentioned that Russia authorized migrants from Mariupol to leave Ukraine, but only to go to Russia itself. Other countries like Poland and Germany have been rather welcoming, especially if we compare their policies with their policies towards other migrants from outside Europe over the last years. How do you explain that on both sides there have been a willingness to take people? Was it simply for humanitarian reasons, or were there also geopolitical reasons in this openness?
I think there were clear geopolitical reasons, in addition to humanitarian reasons and humanitarian support from the Western countries, including European Union countries, to Ukraine, which was very significant during this Russian invasion of Ukraine. There was clear geopolitical reason, because Ukraine is used as a proxy by the West to contain Russia, to weaken Russia. So this is in addition to war between Russia and Ukraine taking place right now, which is interstate war between Russia and Ukraine. There is also civil war, which I mentioned, which is still ongoing, kind of because a lot of fighters are from separatist Donbass, including also from Crimea, which are next by Russia. But in addition to this, there is also proxy war between West and NATO and Russia in Ukraine, because Western countries, NATO members, including European Union members, they use Ukraine as a proxy to kind of contain Russia, to weaken Russia, and this is would explain their support for Ukrainian refugees and humanitarian support, kind of in order to alleviate a kind of effect of this war on Ukraine. And this is kind of, I think, a very important issue and very important dimension, which also explains U.S. policy and policies of countries like Canada. Even so, this is not publicly acknowledged often by politicians, but some of them publicly stated this, including U.S. Minister of Defense, Pentagon chief, publicly stated basically the goal of the United States is to weaken Russia. And this is even today visit by Joe Biden to Kyiv, Ukraine, is just an illustration of this. So he basically went there as a boss, basically to show that he's basically who makes decision about war and peace in Ukraine, and not Zelensky. Actually, Zelensky is and this is based on my research and a lot of evidence, that since Maidan, Ukraine became a client state of the United States, and a lot of key decisions, like including during war in Donbass, are made by the United States and not by the Ukrainian government. Specifically, after Maidan, the U.S. government told new Ukrainian government not to resist Russian annexation of Crimea militarily, and this is what happened. Basically, Russia was able to annex Crimea without any kind of military fighting, without any kind of violent conflict. And this is one example. But after another example, that there was during Russian invasion, few weeks after Russian invasion, there was possibility of peaceful agreement, but United States and United Kingdom blocked this peaceful agreement because they wanted to use this as proxy war and weaken Russia. And this was reported by Ukrainian media in May, citing sources close to Zelensky. And recently, Israeli Prime Minister confirmed this. He was the one who was leading such negotiations, and he confirmed there was a real possibility of peace deal, but United States and United Kingdom basically blocked this agreement, possibility such agreement. And now I think there was, before Biden's visit to Ukraine, U.S. administration stated to U.S. media, Politico, that United States called for Zelensky to launch counteroffensive now. So basically, this is, and there is a lot of evidence that the United States military also involved in provision of intelligence, like battlefield intelligence, selecting targets, approving targets, providing information about location of Russian military forces, about their plans, and so on. And also giving instructions and even kind of leading operations to check back, for instance, Zaporizhia, not Zaporizhia, but Kharkiv region, part of occupied by Russia, was a military operation which was planned by Western military kind of advisors or kind of military leaders or commanders, not by Ukrainian forces. And this is just one example. So now Ukraine basically is client state in which Ukraine and Ukrainians are used by the West to achieve their goals. And I think kind of a lot of humanitarian assistance, not just because of political, even so this is just explained by supporting Ukraine, but actually this has a very negative effect because Ukrainians have to die, and the consequences for Ukraine are just terrible, and the amount of aid will not be able to compensate all the losses in terms of life. Very large number of Ukrainians killed, specifically military, a lot of destruction, and in terms of economic future, now it's very difficult to predict what would happen. And I think a lot of people who move out of Ukraine would not return back. I think they would stay or would like to stay in Western Europe or countries like Poland or even countries like Canada. And I think this is another issue. So now I think I'm quite pessimistic about future of Ukraine for this reason, because of this kind of conflict and its nature. And outcome is, I think, would be very negative for Ukraine in terms of long-run impact.
But how does the openness to immigrants from Ukraine concretely help the Ukrainian side in this conflict? You mentioned that it's the Ukrainian military forbids to men in fighting age to leave. So when Western countries take in Ukrainian immigrants, is it a way to let those men fight without having family obligations? What are the reasons, according to you, for the openness, for being open to Ukrainian immigrants in order to help Ukraine in this war?
Yes, this is one of the reasons, because kind of without men, a lot of women and children would be very difficult for them to survive economically, and help and assistance and provided by Western countries allows them to kind of to have some kind of temporary solution to this issue, to have some economic assistance, some housing, and so on. And for men, basically, to continue fighting or to be able to stay in Ukraine. And a lot of them wanted to leave Ukraine, but they are not able to do this, so because of this law. So this basically ensures that kind of Ukrainian men would have no choice but to fight. And there are a lot of videos of Ukrainian men now taken by force into military. Even so, there was a lot of volunteers at the start of the Russian invasion who joined voluntarily Ukrainian forces and territorial defense in particular. But now a lot of there is much less willingness to do this, and there is much more kind of use of force to force men into Ukrainian military. And this is one reason, again, which will be very difficult, because a lot of, in addition to a lot of Ukrainian men who are killed during this war, which I mentioned already, more than 30,000, based on my estimates, based on official Ukrainian government admissions of such casualties. So according to recent data, more than 100 Ukrainians are killed. Military members are killed, and other forces members are killed in this war during just one day, on average, each day. So there are a lot of casualties, but in addition to this, the number of wounded is very large, because for about one person killed, typically there are like about four wounded. And a lot of people who are wounded, they would not be able to walk they lost their kind of hands or feet and so on, or they have very severe injuries, which would prevent them from walking. And this would be again a very important solution, because if they could not walk, they would need not only kind of to provide economic benefits for their families, but they also need to be taken care of by themselves. And this is a very important issue, because kind of in the future it becomes very tough for kind of in terms of Ukraine to function as a country, because of a lot of people move to Western kind of countries as refugees, especially women and children, and men who stay in Ukraine. A lot of them are casualties of this conflict, wounded, which would also kind of make kind of in terms of long-term effect would be very negative. And I think this is a very important issue, which is often also not mentioned. But I think there is another reason for supporting Ukrainian immigration, or kind of refugees, acceptance of refugees in contrast to kind of refugees from other countries, is because kind of this would be like cheap labor, kind of which would be a source specifically for jobs which do not require any qualification, basically like money, or kind of like in construction, or kind of in retail and so on, jobs which kind of, or in factories. For instance, this would kind of enable to resolve this deficit or shortage of people to work in these countries, because before the war there was also significant illegal immigration of Ukrainians in countries like Italy, Poland. There were a lot of kind of Ukrainians who moved for economic reasons to these countries. They worked there, and mostly illegally. Many of them got a legal status afterwards, but this was kind of economic motivation to move and stay in these countries, specifically for reasons to do jobs, and often the jobs are unqualified jobs, low-paying jobs, but this was still considered to be better compared to what was possible to get in UK. I think this is another motivation to kind of to find kind of such support for refugees from Ukraine. And this is also, I think, an important issue. For instance, in Canada, people who moved to Canada as based on this new program, which is called QAED program, for helping Ukrainians affected by the war, they are not called refugees, so they don't get any benefits as refugees. They basically get work permit, which basically tells them to have a job. If they could not do a job, so basically they could not stay in Canada, or it will be very difficult for them to stay in Canada for long term, because they will not get any like protection like refugees. They have opportunity to work, and a lot of people who move to Canada, they find jobs which are not qualified jobs, low-paying jobs, but they have often no choice because of the war, and because there are no other countries alternatives to find any kind of similar or better solution in this case.
Yeah, so there is some form of externalization of social and economic functions through immigration. That is, in the absence of a functioning labor market in Ukraine, you can find this a substitute in neighboring countries. Likewise, you can find some sort of social assistant in other countries, as it is lacking within Ukraine in the context of the war. And I suppose that there are similar reasons on the Russian side. That is, you mentioned that Russia allowed some people to leave Mariupol, but only to go to Russia. Why did Russia want to take those people?
I think again there are like political reasons, because Russia invaded UK, so they wanted also kind of to use this for political reasons, to justify the Russian invasion, because they claim humanitarian reasons for the invasion of Ukraine. Even so, just as I mentioned, genocide. So they would use the refugees, basically show that they provide protection. And this is why, for instance, they also take children from orphanages to Russia, just to show that this is like humanitarian reasons and so on. But in addition to kind of geopolitical reasons, Russia also used kind of refugees from Ukraine also for similar purposes, like to fill jobs, like a lot of jobs and unqualified jobs in Russia, specifically in regions which are not well populated. So a lot of refugees were given the opportunity to move, for instance, to Siberia, or to kind of other remote regions like rural areas, not to Moscow, not to St. Petersburg, but basically to regions which would be which have not very good conditions of life, but Russian government wanted to basically settle them in these regions or Far Eastern regions of Russia, which have declining population. So this was another opportunity basically for Russia to use Ukrainian refugees for such purposes. In addition to geopolitical reasons, in addition to humanitarian reasons, this was also economic reason and justification. And I think a lot of people who moved as refugees both to Russia and to Western countries and countries like European Union members like Poland or Czech Republic would want to stay there for a long time. So this means now this will be again a very long term impact on Ukraine, because a lot of people who are in their job age and would remain outside of Ukraine for even after war would end. And this would mean that a lot of this would be a big problem, because already Ukraine had a very difficult situation because of aging population. There are a lot of people who are like in retirement age, and it was basically before the war there was almost 1-to-1 person who was working and was employed, and one person who was already retired, because retirement age was relatively low in Ukraine, and especially for women. And this meant now that a lot of people who are work age left Ukraine, and people who are older age remain in Ukraine. This would also be a very important issue. What would happen to them, and what would happen in terms of provision of a social safety net, social safety and retirement payments and so on after the war, because now Ukrainian government is able to provide pensions and other social benefits for Ukrainians, like medicine, medical care, and so on, and even salaries to government employees by using Western economic support. And a lot of this support are in the forms of loans, which which Ukrainian government would have to repay after the war, which would again create even more dependency and would put in a much more difficult situation Ukrainian government after the war, because it would need to have a lot of money to repay this economic support from Western countries after including salaries paid and payments and pensions and so on. And it would not be enough for Ukrainian economy to provide income to be able to for Ukrainian again standards of living to remain in pre-war level. And this is would, I think, even lead to more immigration. After, if war would end, a lot of men would also leave Ukraine to Western countries, or would try to do this, because it would be a very difficult situation in terms of economic for Ukraine to survive after the war. And I think the war, but I think the war would continue now likely for not for quite a long time, because neither Russia, neither Ukraine has a willingness to peacefully resolve this. They have very different demands. Zelensky proclaims that his goal is to take back control over not only Donbass but also Crimea, which is close to zero chance. And Russia basically also is not able to defeat Ukraine. I don't think that they want to occupy entire Ukraine, but they are not able to achieve regime change in Ukraine into pro-Russian government. And to do this militarily, it will take very long time and a lot of Russian casualties to even take back control over Donbass and other regions of Ukraine, like southern and eastern Ukraine, to be incorporated into Russia. So this would mean that the conflict would continue for a long time unless something radical happens. And I think unless, for instance, Western countries decide to that a peaceful resolution would be a possibility. In such case, the conflict can end soon. But I don't see any such prospect, because Western countries, the United States in particular, still continue this policy of using Ukraine as a proxy with war with Russia.
That's a very interesting point. You mentioned that for Russia, it's also an opportunity to find sometimes Russian-speaking people to populate far eastern areas of Russia. So they take in the pool of Ukrainian population for this purpose. There may be a last reason, which is particularly at stake in the neighboring countries, and the EU support for those neighboring countries is precisely trying to mitigate the risks that you mentioned. You mentioned that the main country in the West receiving Ukrainian migrants is Poland, both because it's a country which is directly confronted to the inflow, but also because there is an openness in that country, and certainly EU and Western support for Poland to take many migrants. And by having Ukrainian migrants in Poland, we can expect them to be more likely to return to to Ukraine later than migrants, for instance, in the UK or Canada. Those ones, for sure, they are very unlikely to return. So there may be a specific strategy as well to promote the emigration of Ukrainians to Poland and very nearby countries in order to promote later the return of those migrants to Ukraine.
But I think this may be a more complex situation because Poland is Slavic country, so the language issue is a very important issue for refugees from Ukraine, because a lot of refugees who move to Canada or to countries like Germany or France or kind of Italy or Spain, they do not speak languages. So this means it will be very tough to find jobs or even integration in society would be very difficult, like education, like schools and so on. But in Poland, it's possible to understand Polish because Polish is a language which is similar to Ukrainian, a lot of similarities. So communication is much easier. It's much easier to find jobs and use language for a lot of Ukrainians in Poland. And there is also kind of historical connection. A lot of Ukrainians in Western Ukraine still know Polish because, like Western Ukraine used to be part of Poland until World War II. So this means there are still a lot of people who speak Polish and understand Polish, and even my own family, they live in Poland after before World War II until they were expelled as a part of ethnic cleansing as Ukrainians after World War II. So this is kind of a situation when I think a lot of Ukrainians would want to stay in Poland for a longer time, and specifically because even Polish government policy before the Russian invasion was to give Ukrainian opportunities to stay in Poland. So they gave permit. It's easier to get permit for Ukrainians in Poland, than in many other countries to work and to stay for long term, because Poland also has similar kind of situation of finding basic economic workforce for unqualified jobs like factories and so on, retail and so on, low-paying jobs. And a lot of Ukrainians are able to work in such jobs, but also some doctors are able to find jobs in Poland. But when they move to Western countries, they, like for instance in Canada, any kind of education qualifications like doctors are not able to work in Canada. Ukrainian doctors or teachers or any other qualified professionals, they are not able to find jobs in Canada because this Canada requires Western education or recognition of such degrees, and Ukrainian degrees are not recognized as equivalent. So this makes it very difficult because doctors, for instance, would have to work on qualified jobs, and Poland in this regard is better because in Poland there was also immigration from Poland to Western Europe, in particular United Kingdom, after Poland became member of European Union. So a lot of people moved from Poland to like Germany, to like United Kingdom, because of higher salaries, more economic prospects. And for this reason, Polish government wants to use Ukrainian kind of migrants, refugees, to fill out this kind of gap in terms of movement of economic workforce, and specifically for low qualified jobs or jobs which would not be like agriculture jobs and so on, which would be low paying but not qualified. But Ukrainian refugees and migrants would be willing to work in these occupations and these jobs.
A very good point that after the large immigration waves from Poles in the European Union, having some immigrants from Ukraine may be also useful economically for Poland. Anyway, so that's we have discussed various aspects of the conflict, its causes, the importance of the displacements of population that it has triggered, and also why these movements of population matter to the major actors of this conflict. And you, Ivan, you have been very active on these various questions. You have given a lot of interviews. Have written a lot of newspaper articles. You are also very active on Twitter. So how do you see the role of intellectual and researchers in this conflict? There are, like many wars, this conflict is characterized by the fog of war, both on the Western side and on the Russian side. The media have clearly taken side. What is the role of intellectuals and researchers in this context, and what are the needs that they can answer?
The role of intellectuals is very important in this war, because this is like conflict which needs to be understood. Before it can be resolved, it's necessary to understand how we can qualify this conflict, what are the reasons for this conflict, how it's possible to resolve this conflict, what are options. And I think there is a failure, intellectual failure in the West to deal with this war, which is, I think, the most important conflict right now in the world, most important issue in the world. But there is little interest, actually, among a lot of intellectuals, there is a little interest in actually trying to understand the causes of this conflict, origins of this conflict, complex nature of this conflict, and what you see a lot of in media publications. This is quite surprising, and also like social media, there is often like this perspective, like a kind of like talking using analogy from World War II, applying to this conflict, which is kind of there are different wars taking place since World War II and even before World War II, which are much more similar to war in Ukraine. But they always apply this is like a struggle between a kind of um, of World War II level, which is I regard this is I also studied World War II, and this is not applicable, I think, in this case to this war. But they often use such analogy, and when you have an analogy of World War II, so you have basically this very little to discuss. So this is like would cause any option to discuss and even debate, because this is like a kind of such a perspective which limits intellectual possibility to discuss this. And for this reason, I think another issue is that a lot of intellectuals they don't know a lot about this conflict, its origins and background and its nature, because they rely on media, kind of and media and politicians. They give kind of perspective which is very different from what's taking place. And this is what I mentioned, and this is why I think research is very important by scholars who study conflict professionally, and we need to address this issue professionally, not using like politics, not to give people what they want to hear, like which is often given by politicians and experts, which are used kind of by the media. So they tell people what they want to hear, like that Ukraine is winning this war, that there is a genocide, kind of, and so on. This is like all this kind of talk, which is, I think, is not helping Ukraine, because for the reasons which I mentioned, which is actually has negative impact on this war, because alternatives are actually much more difficult now, and lost opportunities actually in the future of Ukraine are much more difficult as a result of this lost opportunities, which I mentioned, like preventing this war or getting European Union membership or having peaceful kind of resolution of this conflict, which was blocked before. So a lot of people just follow kind of in terms, including surprisingly intellectuals who are supposed to be kind of more curious and more kind of independent in their views. They touch basically they just follow all this perspective, which is kind of based on media coverage, which is often kind of very primitive and often inaccurate. And another issue is that now it became very difficult, even for researchers, for academics, to voice their opinion. So a lot of dominant kind of perspective narratives are based on views of politicians or views by experts who have no knowledge of Ukraine or conflict, but they are like former military officials or former government officials, and they now became experts in Ukraine, and genuine academic experts, including from Ukraine, like who study this. And there are only few experts in the West who are actually Ukrainians who know languages, who are able to kind of do research about this conflict professionally, not just relying on this kind of knowledge. They are experts in conflicts. They study not only this conflict but many other conflicts. But this is actually their views are not given even opportunity to present, and even often it's not possible. Even in academia now, it's not possible even to publish something. Kind of, I recently had a paper on the Maidan massacre, which was accepted by after peer review was accepted by editor from a social science journal, from a peer review journal, based on my research. And after this acceptance was based on peer review, and And then the journal changed this decision, and they rejected my article basically because kind of openly saying, editor was mentioning that this is like the problem is not with article, is evidence is solid, and peer reviewers agree with my evidence about my massacre, which was presented in my study. But the problem was political, because political conclusions, they do not like political conclusion. Editor, kind of another editor who blocked this acceptance of my article, and one of the peer reviewers did not like my kind of conclusions of political implications of my article about origins of this conflict, and this is why they rejected this article. So it's not even possible often now for academics like scholars like me who study this conflict for a very long time, even to publish something in academia, because politics now dominates. And this is, I think, very unfortunate, because if you have conflict, then knowledge about this conflict needs to be the most important issue. There is need for such knowledge, and if you have censorship of ideas which are goes against government narrative, this is a problem not with researchers who study this. This is a problem with such narrative, and this is like in democracies, it's necessary to have views of different people, and especially people who might have provide a solution to this conflict. But I think now, because of political reasons, which I mentioned, using Ukraine for proxy war, researchers are not views of actual researchers, scholars who study this conflict are not in demand. They are they are not dominant. Basically, they are overwhelmed by views of politicians, by the media, and by people who have no knowledge about this conflict, but now regarded as experts, and they dominate the media coverage and social media and other perspectives. And I think this is again very unfortunate for Ukraine and for this conflict, because knowledge now is suppressed and in favor of politics, and politics is dominant. But I think for the future of Ukraine, this is and for resolution of this conflict, which affects also people in many other countries and has the potential of becoming much wider. So it's necessary to understand what happened and what kind of consequences it will be, and how it's possible to resolve this conflict.
Yeah, it's perfectly clear that there is a need of knowledge about both the causes and the possible solutions, and the side that will be the most knowledgeable is going to prevail at the end of the day. The side that will understand the local reality very well and be able to design tailored solutions to stabilize the country is going to prevail. So the idea that expertise and knowledge are necessary is clear. The question that you suggest is whether there is a genuine demand for this kind of services on both sides, and both of us, we are on the Western side, that is in the West. You mentioned some form of censorship. So do you think there is no demand for expertise services, or do you think there is nevertheless, and major institutions are ready to reach out to experts and people like you who know well the situation to find solutions to this conflict?
So I can compare, just my experience and my knowledge with this war after Russian invasion with what happened in Ukraine after Maidan. So after Maidan, there was some more openness for views of academics, researchers, and experts, or actually academic experts like me on this conflict and this war. For instance, I was asked by U.S. Congress members to give my expert opinion on this on issues, which were also used by U.S. Congress to adopt amendment, which was based on my research partially and research by other scholars, which was adopted unanimously by U.S. Congress. I also was invited by other U.S. government agencies to work as an expert, as an expert on Ukraine, to provide my expert knowledge on Ukraine. I also did this for Canadian government, to provide expert opinion and expert knowledge, and give lectures about Ukrainian conflicts and so on to Canadian government and military who went to Ukraine before this war. But after the war, this again, basically no government express any interest in any opinion this is, I think, quite surprising, because now this even became much more important and much more dangerous. So, but now this very little kind of interest in this regard. And the same media, like, again, it was possible. I published after Maidan, I published my article like in Washington Post, and had interviews like with Reuters, Associated Press. My research was also published like on this wars in Ukraine, in war in Donbass, and other issues was published by a lot of other media, like Guardian, about World War II, and so a lot of top media published my research and so on. But after this war, again, especially this U.S. media, there was almost a very significant drop in interest. There was I gave a lot of interviews to Canadian media, to European, to Spanish media, or other media in European countries, but in US media, like top media, basically, like Washington Post, now even it's not possible to publish anything. So basically, it became closed. So US media, which is leading democracy in the world, but the media become basically closed to kind of even to opinions, because this is not based on knowledge. Because I see, like I read each day articles in US media, publications about this war by people who have no knowledge. Basically, I do not see any kind of expert knowledge, any background, anything, but they publish their articles, they publish their kind of, they're quoted in media and so on. But actual experts now, it's not possible to have any kind of views by leading media, like for instance, Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, and so on. They basically block from any kind of using experts on this regard. And this is a big change from what happened since Maidan. Even so, there was similar trajectory since Maidan, but this is now very kind of different outcome. And I think this is a big issue, because if you have such censorship in this regard by the media, kind of by leading media, like leading democracy, like in the United States, which was kind of a model for the world, this would have, I think, very significant implications, because there are no debates in the US. So this is like, for me, this is like often looks like the Soviet Union, when you have just one party line on this issue, and there are no debates. And even you have to agree with this, even if you're academic. Basically, if you don't agree with this, so basically you cannot do anything. So they ignore this, or you consider this kind of not acceptable. So that's why this is very dangerous. And the same even applies now to academia. So I published a lot of articles, books on this topic before. Even it was not easy to do this. Again, it was considered to be difficult topic. When I was given an interview, when I was given a presentation based on my research about regional divisions and conflicts in Ukraine at Harvard University Ukrainian Research Institute about 2010, I was told by one professor who was, again, one of top scholars in Ukrainian studies that at Harvard, that I should not talk about this issue of regional divisions and conflicts in Ukraine, because this is a dangerous issue. So because even talking about this issue is dangerous. So he told me this is like this issue basically needs to be ignored for political reasons. And this is professor at Harvard who studies Ukrainian kind of history and so on. But you cannot study this issue. And this is like was kind of even at the time was kind of trying to kind of prevent a discussion of this issue and so on. And after Maidan, it becomes even more significant. And now after Russian invasion, it becomes much more even difficult in academia to publish anything which is not kind of consistent with this narrative, because kind of what I mentioned, like my Maidan massacre article, I had similar kind of issue. This far right article, which is about role of far right, which is another issue which I researched for a very long time. Again, you have and just today again issue with this article about war between Russia and Ukraine. This is again they do not even send to basically editors are afraid to publish research which goes academic research. They do not even submit this to peer review, and if it's submitted to peer review, this is actually unaccepted after peer review. This is still could not be published, because this would contradict all this simplistic and kind of and narrative which is based on politics but not based on real facts, which is much more complex. This is not like kind of something which is how to say kind of something which is just speculation or something. This is based on research, based on kind of theories, based on evidence, but now it's not possible even in academia to publish this with a few exceptions. I think this is a very dangerous trajectory in this regard. If you have censorship in academia, this is like becomes on such issue, crucial issue, then it becomes what's the purpose of academia when scholars are supposed to have tenure tenure, supposed to protect academic freedom and not basically just follow what the narrative from the government or politicians or by the media. Because if scholars just repeat everything which is said by the media, by the government, by politicians, then there is no need for academics in the first place. Because why to do any research if this research just repeats kind of research which is given by politicians, or not research by narratives given by politicians without any evidence and then repeated by the media. And this is very dangerous negative development, and I'm going to see if this is going to be again a long-term development. But I think the trajectory now is very kind of negative in this regard.
All right, yes. So it seems that ideological or even nationalistic affiliation, in this case, Trump's real expertise in this information market. Let's see how long it lasts and where it leads. So we have had some students of mine who are listening to us. Antoine has been working on this issue. Antoine has gone to Ukraine and he has produced a policy brief recently published by LMEP about population displacements in the Ukraine war. Antoine, do you want to ask a question to Ivan?
Yes, good evening, and thank you for this very interesting speech. I had two questions which are actually related to each other about the causes of the war in Ukraine. The first one is this one. Do you think that the border delimitation of the Socialist Republic of Ukraine in the 1920s under Moscow's authority could be mentioned among the causes of the current war in Ukraine? And if yes, do you think it would be relevant to compare the situation between Ukraine and Russia regarding their borders with the one of other ex-Soviet socialist republics, such as Armenia and Azerbaijan, for instance?
Yes, I think this is like would be relevant, I think, because this is how Ukraine emerged, and the history of Ukraine is also relevant. And in my dissertation and in my book, which I publish, I compare like differences, political differences in Ukraine after independence, and this difference go back to historical experience. Because, as I mentioned, Western Ukraine used to be part of Poland before World War II, but before this, many regions of Western Ukraine used to be part of Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was very different politically and a geopolitical orientation compared to regions of other regions of Ukraine, which used to be part of the Russian Empire and then part of the Soviet Union. So a lot of these regions have very different historical experience, and this would explain why Western Ukraine was always pro-Western and Eastern Ukraine was pro-Russian in terms of their orientation, which goes back to historical reasons, specifically after Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union, but also before when Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire. But in addition to this, the issue of borders of Ukrainian state is a very crucial issue, because Putin specifically mentioned this in his publication. He specifically mentioned that borders of Ukraine, which were established by the Soviet leaders after Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union, he said that they included a lot of regions which were Russian regions. So this kind of provides a justification for Russian invasion. So Russia used justification for its invasion, basically saying that a lot of regions of Ukraine, like Crimea, which was given by to Ukraine from the Russian Federation by Khrushchev during Soviet times, the Putin justified this annexation of this region also by saying this was given illegally, this was Russian region historically and so on. Before Khrushchev's decision, even going back to the Russian Empire, and the same was applying to Donbass and other regions. Basically, Putin stated that Ukraine is not actual country, or not not a real country, because it includes the regions which he called Novorossiya regions, which are regions in the south of Ukraine and eastern Ukraine. And this would be one of the reasons why Russia annexed these regions of Ukraine, not only Donbass, which is populated by almost half of the population ethnically Russian, and they annexed Crimea, which is mostly ethnically Russian region, but they also basically annexed the regions of Kherson and part of the Zaporizhia region, and which are ethnically Ukrainian, but Putin regarded them as historically part of Russia, using this term Novorussia or New Russia as a term going back to kind of pre-Soviet times. And he said basically the Soviet decision by Lenin basically to establish borders of Soviet Socialist Republics of Ukraine was not actually based on real population. A lot of regions he claimed were historically Russian. This would be one of the reasons which was used by Putin to justify Russian invasion of Ukraine and annexation of these regions of Ukraine in the south and the east. And this might be also explanation why Russia might not be limited just to annexing Donbass and regions of Kherson and region also of Zaporizhia, but they might also go to other regions which they consider to be part of Novorussia or New Russia, which is like a part of, for instance, Odessa region in the south and Kharkiv region in the east. So this is other potential regions which might be annexed by Russia if Russia would be able to occupy them using military force.
Okay.
All right. And Anna has been a student of mine of international history. Anna, do you have a question for Ivan?
Yes, thank you very much for interesting discussion. And I have also two questions. The first one is about NATO and Ukraine relations, and particularly I would like to ask you about the Bucharest summit in 2008. So both Ukraine and Georgia were promised that both countries would become members of the NATO, and it's been 15 years. And after Bucharest summit, Georgia was attacked by Russia and Ukraine in 2014, and now this war of aggression that the whole world seeing what Russia is doing in Ukraine. So would you expect that Ukraine would insist on would climb on its right, so to speak, to become a member of NATO anytime soon? What's your assumption and expectations in this regard? And secondly, and especially because the Baltic states was also, I mean, they share relatively the same history, right? Because they were also members of the Soviet Union and they also share border with Russia, and yet membership was not denied to them, but it was denied to Georgia and Ukraine. So what's your assumptions and expectations in this regard? And second question is about peaceful resolutions that you mentioned a couple of times. How do you see, if you have any sort of suggestions, what should be on the table? What can Ukraine negotiate on, and what can Ukraine suggest in this respect? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. I wrote an article on this topic of European Union and NATO integration of countries, post-communist countries. So I look into statistically in all the countries and in terms of their integration and accession of European Union and NATO. And I published this article in 2011, I think 2011 or 2010 in peer review journal. And based on my research, then I said there was basically countries which are post-Soviet, including countries specifically. I mentioned countries which would include Ukraine, Georgia, also like Armenia and Moldova and Belarus. They had no real prospects of becoming members of European Union or NATO, in contrast to countries which were countries like in Poland, which became, or Czech Republic, which became members of these both organizations, but also countries in former Yugoslavia, which were offered membership for European Union as became already members, like Slovenia and Croatia had the possibility of joining the European Union and become members of NATO. And in contrast also to Baltic states. I think the reason for this, because they used to be part of the Soviet Union. So this was a big division which prevented countries of post-Soviet countries, with the exception of Baltic states, of becoming members of the European Union and becoming also members of NATO. Even before this war and before the Russian invasion, which and I think this the key distinction why Baltic states were able to join the European Union and NATO goes back to history, because Western countries, including the United States, never recognized annexation of these regions by the Soviet Union during World War II, as a result of Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So this was not recognized by the Western countries, and the Baltic states were regarded basically as part of the West, which was illegally annexed by then Soviet Union. And for this reason, they were able to get a very fast track into European Union membership and NATO but the same did not apply to countries like Russia, Ukraine, or Belarus, or Moldova, and Georgia, because they were part of the Soviet Union, but considered to be part of Russian sphere of influence. And another reason why it would be very difficult to become members of the European Union and NATO is because of there are like different factors basically, but economic development was much weaker in these countries. So economically, Ukraine is one of the poorest countries, and Moldova, for instance, one of the poorest countries in Europe. And also Georgia has a very significant economic decline after its wars and conflicts. So this is countries in terms of economic development, they are much less economically developed compared to Baltic states or countries like Czech Republic or Slovakia or Slovenia or Poland. So this means that for economically it would be necessary to have very significant funding from countries of European Union to provide support for European Union membership. But in terms of NATO, there is a security issue because to become members of NATO for countries which are in the middle of a conflict, like including Georgia, there was like dispute between kind of this Russian recognized independence of South Ossetia as a result of this war between Russia and Georgia in 2018, and Abkhazia, which is again kind of and in case of Moldova, similar issue with Transnistria region, which is not recognized by Russia, but de facto is independent. In case of Ukraine, this issue with Crimea, which is annexed by Russia, now also with Donbass, which is also annexed by Russia. So this means that all these countries have territorial conflicts with Russia and potential military conflict with Russia. So for them to become members of NATO would require that NATO would agree basically to possibility of war with Russia, with nuclear power country, with nuclear country. For this reason, like Western countries would have almost no kind of real kind of desire to accept these countries into NATO, because this would mean that they would have to fight Russia, or kind of nuclear, which might lead to nuclear war. So for this reason, kind of, I don't think that there is any real prospect of membership of countries like Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova in NATO for kind of immediate future, unless something radically changed. For instance, there would be kind of war outcome which would be very different, or there will be some major changes in policy or Russian leadership or and so on. But this is not very likely. And I think this is a very crucial issue, because now Zelensky policy, even before this war and after the war, was basically to promise Ukraine that Ukraine would become member of NATO very soon. And he kind of still continues this policy now, with one exception. So after Russian invasion, Zelensky agreed basically to Ukraine become a neutral country. And this was a very major change. And this was also a very important change, because Russia, one of the key demands of Russia was that Ukraine not to join NATO. And before the war, there was also this was the same Russian demand, basically for the Western countries to renounce Ukraine from any prospect of joining NATO. This was key demand by Russia, and this demand was refused by Western countries and by Ukraine. And I think this was a very missed chance, because in reality, there was no real prospect of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. So this was no big concession to give, but in exchange, it was possible to avoid this war, which has devastating effect on Ukraine. So this is kind of, I think this was a very kind of important issue which lost solution. This was one way in which a peaceful resolution of this conflict would happen, but it never happened because of kind of basically refusal to kind of admit that Ukraine would not become a member of NATO, basically to admit reality. And because publicly, specifically during this Bucharest summit, NATO agreed that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO in some future without actually having any real opportunity to do this. And Zelensky, in one of his interviews, I think CNN interviews, said that he was privately told by Western government officials and leaders from Western countries that Ukraine has no possibility of joining NATO, but publicly they cannot say this. So this was basically policy of kind of using just public promises without any possibility of real membership. And this is actually kind of was one missed possibility to resolve this conflict. And I think in terms of how peaceful resolution could be achieved, I think this is one also key issue. I think Ukraine agreeing to becoming a neutral country or not joining NATO is a kind of real possibility to have some kind of peaceful resolution of this conflict, because the peaceful agreement, which was negotiated by Israeli Prime Minister soon after Russian invasion in March of last year, kind of involved this promise by Zelensky that Ukraine would not become a member of NATO, which is again not a very big kind of concession, because in reality this is not very likely to happen in any case in any future, unless something radical would change. And I think this is a kind of a possibility. But now I think peaceful resolution is much more difficult, because after now Russia annexed regions of Ukraine, Donbass and Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, so Russia would not renounce kind of annexation of these regions in contrast to situation when this was possible in March of last year. It was possible for Russia kind of to withdraw from occupied regions of Kherson and Zaporizhia and Kharkiv, because at the time Russia did not have any kind of occupation administration from these regions in contrast to Donbass, and this was actually kind of also missed opportunity. But now I think it would be for Ukrainian government to agree to this, and for Western governments to agree to this would be not acceptable. So I think real possibility of peaceful resolution is now very, very small. And I think one possible outcome would be basically to leave this kind of outside, to leave status of these regions outside of agreement, which was also debated and as a possible solution during talks which were held by Israeli Prime Minister, peace talks, and basically to say that the status of these regions will be determined later and accept de facto solution, similar to what was accepted by Poroshenko and Western leaders in case of Minsk agreement. So this would be like basically a new Minsk agreement, but more formal and involving kind of countries, not only Ukraine but also United States and other countries, which would provide more kind of guarantees this agreement would be fulfilled. But I don't think this is again any real possibility, because of policies of now Russia and Western countries and Ukraine. They only prefer now military solution to this conflict. So military solution they regard as possibility of winning this war as a real possibility. But I don't think this is a very good option for Ukraine, because Russia has much bigger military advantage, and even with supplies of Western weapons, still Russia has military advantage, and they can still mobilize more forces and still can kind of fight in Ukraine. So the only outcome which is most likely is now this kind of basically acceptance of de facto status of basically frontline situation similar to Korea war outcome, or acceptance of some kind of de facto status formally as a part of agreement, but again, which is not very likely. But the military solution would so basically fate of Ukraine would be decided as a result of this war, and I'm kind of skeptical that Ukraine would be able to defeat Russia, because again, Ukraine has a disadvantage in this regard in terms of military force, and Russia still is nuclear power, so Russia can always use a kind of set of nuclear weapons if there would be threat to Crimea or any other regions of Russia controlled by Russia, for instance, annexed region of Donbass as well. So in this case, again, Russia would not agree to kind of to renouncing its annexed regions of Crimea and Donbass in any case, and they claim also kind of control over a wider part of Ukraine. So this is, I think, now a very tough situation, very difficult situation, and peaceful solution, I think, would still be beneficial for Ukraine, because the longer war continues, the worse situation for Ukraine would be. And this is now, I think, acknowledged by many other kind of politicians and experts, but even so they do not talk about this publicly. I think this is a very tough situation for Ukraine in the future, and Putin's speech tomorrow would be very crucial in this regard. If for instance, he would announce a war, kind of open war with Ukraine, and this would lead to even greater mobilization of Russian forces or so on, or if he might announce some kind of peaceful proposal, basically to accept de facto status, which is, I don't think it would be, again, a long-term solution to this conflict, or viable solution to this conflict.
All right, the question was very good, and the answer as well. That is, there are differences between the Baltic states and Ukraine or Georgia. They are historical. The Baltic states had a longer in the 20th century episode of independence. They are also, and it's partly related to that, the borders are more mixed Ukraine and Georgia with separatist regions that you do not have in the Baltic states, and a lower level of development make also the region less important for foreign powers. I mean, for especially the EU in this case. And so we may be, but hopefully the parallels between Ukraine and Georgia will stop here, because Ukraine will be obviously the main victim of the situation, and the Ukrainian people as well. And as you suggested at the end, we may go towards the situation of Ukraine being a sort of buffer zone between spheres of Western influence and Russia, because fully fledged integration of Ukraine could be quite dangerous, and as well also economically costly for the EU. In any case, this has been a devastating conflict already, just after 1 year. A large human toll, millions of people displaced. So I really appreciated all the nuances you provided into the debate, how to give an idea of how complex the situation is. And I leave you the final thought about this question of refugees in the Ukraine war.
I think this issue of refugees would depend on outcome of the war in Ukraine, because if the war would continue for a long time, the number of refugees would increase. In particular, if there would be a new Russian offensive, for instance, which is kind of expected and was announced by even White House recently, that they have information, and Ukrainian government also announced that Russia plans to launch a new large-scale offensive, which would mean kind of fighting going to other regions, particularly if this fighting would involve like major cities like Kharkiv or Dnipro or Odessa. This would mean a much bigger wave of refugees from these regions, and from Western Ukraine as well, even from Kyiv. If the war would impact many other regions of Ukraine, which is again would have an even greater impact on the number of refugees, and this would also mean that a lot of people who just went to other countries temporarily, they wanted just to kind of have a temporary residence during this war, would remain in the countries for a longer time and would not return to Ukraine, because many of them, I think there was evidence that quite a large number of people returned from like Western Europe, from Poland to Ukraine, to regions which are not impacted by this war in particular, but now they would have to come back, or they would kind of have to again leave these areas along with new people. This is, I think, a very crucial issue. So outcome of the war would determine a number of refugees, if this would increase or decrease, and also would determine the fate of refugees in countries, in particular Western Europe and Poland or Canada, if they would stay in these countries or if they would come back to Ukraine. And I think the longer war would continue, the greater chances that number of refugees would increase, that and the number of refugees who are in these countries would want to stay would also increase, which would have again a very negative effect on Ukraine and ability to survive economically and politically in the future, and also militarily in the future, because this would impact kind of Ukrainian ability to again to fight, but also to be viable economically. And I think the one possible solution to this issue is if you can become a member of the European Union, if there's such a possibility, or even not a member of the European Union immediately, but there would be a real prospect of European Union membership with a lot of funding and support from the European Union. In such case, Ukraine might be able to resolve a lot of these issues or try to kind of alleviate these issues. But I'm quite skeptical that this European Union membership would happen soon, or if there's even, and there is no certainty that this membership would happen at all, because of a variety of reasons, some of which I already mentioned in our discussion based on my research. So I think this kind of a very dangerous situation for Ukraine, and a lot of Ukrainians suffer of this war. The refugees actually of this war, a number of refugees, and their fate is just one manifestation of this conflict and the importance of this conflict, which would still impact not only Ukraine but many other countries for a very long time.
All right, thank you very much, Ivan. It was really a pleasure to listen to you.
Yeah,
bye bye.
Yes, thank you.